Have you ever had a stranger change your entire life in just a matter of hours? On a red-eye flight to New York City, a lonely tech millionaire who had forgotten how to feel, a single mother fighting to start over, and a little girl terrified of flying, all met at the exact moment they each needed a miracle. What started with a hand reached out during some turbulence ended up breaking down walls that had taken years to build. A story that will make you believe again in the encounters destiny arranges. Stay until the end and discover how a simple question from a child can heal wounds that not even time could close. Before listening, please note that the following story explores reflective experiences related to family, humanity, and personal responsibility. This content is intended to encourage understanding, compassion, and awareness of choices that may have a lasting impact on life. If you are not ready for these emotions, please consider pausing before continuing. Charles tightened his seatbelt while staring out the plane window. The airport lights were starting to fade into the distance, as if they wanted to say goodbye to him forever. He was 42 years old, with a fortune many would envy, and an emptiness in his chest that no amount of money could fill. 3 weeks ago, he had buried his father in a cold, elegant ceremony, surrounded by people claiming they were sorry, when really they were just calculating their next business deal. Not a single tear had managed to escape his eyes during the funeral. Not one. And that tormented him more than the loss itself. He had taken that red-eye flight to New York City, trying to run away from the memories of the empty penthouse, from the silence that now inhabited every corner of his life. But the truth is, you can't escape what you carry inside. The plane started taxiing down the runway, and Charles closed his eyes, wishing sleep would come fast. He wanted to sleep and not think, not feel, not remember the last conversation with his father. Those words he never said, and that had now turned into ghosts. The engine roared to life, and the plane took off into the darkness of the night. Charles clenched his fists on his legs, trying to control that anguish tightening his throat. To his right, the seats were empty. Perfect, he thought. That way he could keep the distance he liked to maintain with the world. But 2 rows ahead, on the left side of the aisle, the story was completely different. Sarah was holding tight to the hand of her daughter Emma, trying to transmit a calm she didn't feel herself. The 7-year-old girl was visibly trembling, her little blue eyes full of tears she refused to let fall. It was the first time they were flying together, the first time they were doing something like this after their world had collapsed. 8 months ago, Sarah had signed the divorce papers with shaking hands, ending 10 years of marriage and lies. Her ex-husband had decided that his 25-year-old assistant was more interesting than the family he had built. Sarah had cried, she had screamed, she had spent entire nights wondering what she had done wrong. But one morning she woke up and understood something fundamental. She hadn't done anything wrong. The mistake wasn't hers. So she made the bravest decision of her life. She would start over in New York City, where her aunt had lived, where she still had a distant cousin who had offered to help. No guarantees, no perfect plan, just the certainty that staying in that place full of broken memories would be worse. Emma squeezed her mother's hand tighter as the plane began to accelerate. Sarah leaned in close, whispering sweet nothings in her ear, promising her everything was going to be okay. The plane took off with a sharp jolt that made Emma let out a stifled whimper. Sarah pulled her tight against her chest, stroking her blonde hair with infinite tenderness. The little girl buried her face in her mom's sweater, shaking like a leaf in a storm. The other passengers started settling in, some cracking open magazines, others putting on headphones, most of them completely ignoring the terrified little girl. Sarah felt a sharp pang of loneliness in her heart. Before, her ex-husband would have been there. He would have held Emma, maybe cracked a silly joke to distract her. But now they were alone, completely alone in this metal tube flying thousands of feet in the air. The flight attendant came by, offering drinks with a professional smile, and Sarah asked for an orange juice for Emma, hoping a little sugar might calm her nerves. The little girl barely touched it. Her tiny hands were still clutching her mother's arm, like it was the only life raft in the middle of the ocean. Sarah looked around for a distraction, anything that might help her daughter feel better. But everyone seemed wrapped up in their own worlds, in their own lives. No one noticed the scared little girl. No one, except a man with sad eyes sitting 2 rows back. Charles had watched the whole scene unfold from his seat, not that he meant to. He wasn't the type to meddle in other people's business. His whole life he'd stuck to that philosophy. Everyone has their own problems. But something about the way that mother held her daughter, something about the woman's silent desperation, struck a chord he thought was long dead. It vaguely reminded him of when he was a kid himself and was terrified of planes. His father had forced him to get over it cold turkey. No comfort, no hugs, just harsh words about being tough and not being weak. Maybe that's why now, 42 years later, he still couldn't cry over his death. He shook his head, trying to push those thoughts away. This wasn't the time to get nostalgic or sentimental. He had to stay focused on his business meeting, on the contracts he was going to close, on building that empire that kept him busy and far away from uncomfortable emotions. But his eyes drifted back to the little girl. Emma had lifted her head for a moment, and Charles could see the look of pure terror on her face. It wasn't some exaggerated childish fear. It was real. It was the kind of fear that paralyzes you, makes you feel like the world is about to end. And right then and there, something inside him shifted. The cabin lights dimmed, and the pilot announced that they'd be arriving at their destination in about 2.5 hours. Most of the passengers started reclining their seats, getting ready to sleep or watch a movie. But Emma was still wide awake, on high alert, with her eyes wide open, watching every movement of the plane, like she expected the whole thing to fall apart any second. Sarah tried telling her a story, the same one she'd told her since she was a baby. But the words seemed to just vanish in the air, losing their usual magic. The poor girl was way too scared to be distracted by stories about princesses or forest animals. She sighed with exhaustion. She'd been strong for months, the rock her daughter could lean on. But in moments like this, when the weariness weighed on her shoulders and the uncertainty of the future squeezed her heart, she felt as fragile as glass. Had she made the right decision moving to a city where she barely knew a soul? What if everything went wrong? What if she didn't get a job? What if Emma didn't fit in? The questions spun in her mind like an unstoppable whirlwind. She rested her forehead against her daughter's and closed her eyes for a second, silently praying for the strength to keep going. She couldn't imagine that in just a few minutes, everything was about to change in a way she never would have expected. The plane began to shake. First, it was a small tremor, almost unnoticeable, like driving over a pothole. But then it intensified. The lights flickered, and the seatbelt sign turned on with an urgent beep. The pilot's voice came over the speakers, with that controlled tone they use when they want to calm you down, but actually scares you more. "Moderate turbulence," he said. "Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened." Emma let out a sharp scream that pierced the silence of the cabin. Her little hands clutched Sarah's arm so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The plane jolted again, more violently this time, and several passengers cried out in surprise. Sarah hugged her daughter with all her might, whispering that everything would be okay, that it was normal, that it would pass soon. But her own voice was trembling. She was scared too. Emma started to hyperventilate. Her breathing became fast and ragged. Her cheeks turned red and her eyes filled with pure panic. Sarah felt her own heart racing. She didn't know what to do. She had never seen her daughter this scared before. The girl was trembling from head to toe, sobbing incoherent words between desperate gasps. That was when Charles unbuckled his seatbelt. He didn't think, he didn't calculate, he didn't make a mental list of pros and cons like he usually did with everything in his life. He simply acted. He got up from his seat, ignoring the illuminated sign ordering him to stay seated. He walked the few steps separating him from them while the plane kept shaking, and he knelt in the aisle next to Emma. Sarah looked at him in surprise, her eyes full of tears she hadn't wanted to show her daughter. Charles gave her a brief look, as if asking for silent permission, and she nodded without hesitation. He turned toward the girl with a gentleness he didn't even know he possessed. "Hey, little one," he said in a calm but firm voice. "Look at me." Emma didn't answer. She kept her face buried in her mother's chest, sobbing uncontrollably. Charles reached out and gently touched her shoulder. "Little one, I need you to look at me for just a second." The girl slowly lifted her head, her swollen, red eyes meeting the stranger's. "Can you count to 5? Charles asked. Emma nodded through her sobs. "Perfect. Then let's do something." The plane jolted again, but Charles didn't even blink. He held up his right hand in front of Emma's face, showing her his 5 fingers. "We're going to count each finger while you breathe," he explained. "When we touch the first finger, take a breath in through your nose. When we get to the second one, let it out through your mouth. Okay?" Emma looked at him uncertainly, but something in that man's voice, something in the way he looked at her without treating her like she was stupid or just being dramatic, made her trust him. She nodded weakly. Charles began. 1, breathe. He touched her thumb. Emma inhaled shakily. 2, let it out. He touched her index finger, and the little girl exhaled with a small shudder. 3, breathe. Middle finger. 4, let it out. Ring finger. 5, breathe. Pinky. And they started over, again and again. The plane kept moving, but Emma didn't notice it as much anymore. She was focused on those fingers, on that deep voice guiding her with infinite patience. Sarah watched the scene with her heart in her throat, moved to the very core of her being. That man, that complete stranger, was saving her daughter from panic with a gentleness she hadn't seen in a long time. Charles continued the exercise. His voice never wavered. His movements remained firm and steady. Little by little, Emma's breathing began to calm down. Her sobs faded until they were just shaky sighs. The plane stopped shaking so violently, and finally the turbulence stopped completely. The pilot announced that they had made it through the rough patch and that the rest of the flight would be smooth. But Charles didn't move. He stayed right there, kneeling in the aisle, counting fingers with Emma until he was absolutely sure she was calm. The little girl looked at him now with different eyes. There was no terror in them anymore, only curiosity and gratitude. "What's your name?" she asked softly. "Charles," he replied with a small smile. "And yours?" "Emma," she murmured. "What a pretty name," Charles said. Emma smiled for the first time in the entire flight. Sarah felt the tears rolling down her cheeks. She couldn't hold them back anymore. "Thank you," she whispered, looking at Charles with an intensity that caught him off guard. "Thank you for helping her." He nodded, not knowing what to say. He hadn't done anything extraordinary, or so he thought. He had just helped a scared little girl. But the way that woman looked at him, with eyes shining with emotion and genuine gratitude, stirred something inside him. Charles was about to stand up, to go back to his seat and let everything go back to normal. But then Emma did something completely unexpected. She reached out her little hand and grabbed Charles's index finger tightly. "Don't let go," she begged in a small voice. "Please?" Charles froze, looking at that tiny hand clinging to his finger. Then he looked at Sarah, who was watching the scene with silent tears running down her face. "It's all right," he finally murmured. "I won't let go." He settled better in the aisle, leaning his back against the empty seat next to him, keeping his finger firmly inside Emma's hand. The little girl sighed with relief and rested her head on her mother's shoulder, but without ever letting go of that finger that had become her anchor. In a few minutes, her eyes began to close. Her breathing became slow and deep. She had fallen asleep, but her hand kept squeezing Charles's finger as if her life depended on it. He looked at Sarah, and she returned a smile full of emotions that no words could ever express. The plane continued its flight through the darkness of the night, and for the first time in weeks, Charles felt something different in his chest. Something that looked dangerously like peace. Charles remained in that awkward position for nearly half an hour. His back was starting to ache from the strange posture. His left leg had gone numb, but he didn't dare move. Emma was sleeping soundly, her breathing slow and steady, her little hand still clutching his finger as if it were the most valuable treasure in the world. Sarah was watching him in silence, and in her eyes was a mixture of gratitude, wonder, and something else that neither of them dared to name. The turbulence had passed a while ago, and the seatbelt was no longer required. Charles could have gotten up at any moment. He could have gently pulled his finger free from the girl's hand and gone back to his seat. But he didn't. And as he sat there, something extraordinary began to happen inside him. He realized with a clarity that shook him to his core that this was the first time in his adult life that someone genuinely needed him. Not for his money, not for his connections, not for what he could offer them in terms of business or perks. Emma needed him simply because he was there, because he had reached out his hand at just the right moment, because he had given her calm when her world was shaking. And that feeling was so strange, so new, so deeply moving, that Charles felt a lump form in his throat. He looked down at his finger, trapped in that tiny hand, and a wave of emotions he'd been repressing for weeks began to break through. He remembered his father in the hospital, in those final hours before he faded away forever. He had sat there, right next to the bed, but he hadn't known what to say, what to do, or how to express everything he was feeling. His father had always been a hard man, a man of few words and even less affection. He had taught him how to be successful, how to be ruthless in business, how to never show weakness. But he had never taught him how to love, how to open up, how to allow himself to be vulnerable. Charles had grown up believing that emotions were obstacles, that attachment only brought pain, and that it was better to keep his distance from everything and everyone. And now, at 42 years old, with a fortune that many would envy, he realized just how empty his existence had been. He had built an empire, but he had forgotten to build himself. He had accumulated successes, but he had lost the ability to connect with other human beings in a real and deep way. And here he was, on a plane heading to New York City, holding the hand of a little girl he didn't even know, feeling more alive than he had felt in years. A single tear rolled down his cheek, the first one since the funeral, the first one in a long, long time. Sarah noticed that tear, and her heart squeezed with tenderness. She didn't say anything. She just reached out with her free hand and placed it gently on Charles's shoulder in a gesture of silent comfort. He looked up, and their eyes met. In that instant, without a word, they both understood that they weren't so different. Both of them carried wounds. Both of them had lost something fundamental. They were both trying to find their way through the dark. Sarah had lost the dream of eternal love, the safety of a stable home, and her faith in promises. Charles had lost his ability to feel, the connection to his own humanity, and the chance to say goodbye to his father with an open heart. And yet, there they were, two broken souls meeting in the most unexpected place. A small, sad smile appeared on Sarah's lips. "She's special," she whispered, referring to Emma. "She has this way of seeing people for who they really are, not who they pretend to be." Charles nodded slowly. "I know," he murmured. "I'm not good with kids," he admitted with an honesty that surprised even him. "I've never really known how to handle them." Sarah shook her head gently. "That's not true. You just helped her better than anyone else could have." Charles looked back at the sleeping Emma. Her face looked so calm, so peaceful. It was hard to believe that just minutes ago she'd been on the verge of a panic attack. "Where did you learn that?" Sarah asked with genuine curiosity. "That breathing exercise." Charles hesitated a moment before answering. "My father," he finally said. "When I was a kid, I was terrified of flying. He forced me to do it anyway, said men couldn't be cowards. One day, on an especially horrible flight, a flight attendant saw how scared I was and taught me that trick. She was the only person who treated me with kindness that day." He fell silent for a moment, lost in the memory. "I never forgot it," he continued. "And I guess, subconsciously,
I saved it for when someone else might need it." Sarah felt a heaviness in her chest hearing that story.
She could picture a young Charles, scared and alone, looking for comfort that never came. "I'm so sorry you went through that," she said sincerely. He shrugged. It was a long time ago. But Sarah knew those childhood wounds never really disappear. They just get buried deep, and sometimes, in the most unexpected moments, they surface again. The plane continued its night journey over the Midwest plains and toward the bustling East Coast. Outside, the darkness was almost absolute, barely broken by the scattered lights of small towns in the distance. Inside the cabin, most passengers were sleeping or watching movies on their personal screens, oblivious to the transformative moment happening just a few rows away. Charles finally dared to move his leg slightly to get some blood flowing back. Emma stirred a little but didn't wake up. Her hand was still firmly gripping his finger. He smiled without realizing it. It was incredible how something so simple, so small, could mean so much. For years, he had closed multi-million-dollar deals, signed contracts that changed entire industries. He had made decisions affecting the lives of hundreds of employees, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had given him the sense of purpose he felt right then, holding the hand of a scared little girl. Maybe his father was right about one thing. Success isn't measured in money or properties. It's measured in the moments when you actually make a real difference in someone's life. And Charles had just discovered that in the most unexpected way. But what he didn't know was that this discovery was just the beginning of something much deeper. Several minutes passed in comfortable silence. Sarah looked back and forth between her sleeping daughter and the man who was still kneeling in the aisle, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. There was something about him that intrigued her. It wasn't just his looks, although she had to admit to herself that he was an attractive man. With those gray eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 untold stories, it was something deeper. The way he had acted without hesitation, the gentleness in his voice when he spoke to Emma, the infinite patience he had shown. Those weren't qualities you found every day, especially in successful men who were usually too busy with their own affairs. "Charles," she said softly, breaking the silence. He looked up. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," he replied. "What brought you on this flight? I mean, are you going to New York City for business, or—" Her voice trailed off, leaving the question hanging in the air. Charles took a deep breath. Over the years, he had learned to keep his private life exactly that, private. But something about the warmth of this woman, something about the vulnerability of the moment they were sharing, compelled him to be honest. "I'm running away," he finally admitted. Sarah raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Running away," she repeated. "From what?" Charles looked down at Emma's hand, still clinging to his finger. "From myself, I guess. From a house that doesn't feel like a home anymore. From memories that hurt too much." He paused before continuing. "My father died 3 weeks ago. I have a business meeting in New York City tomorrow, but the truth is, I just needed to get out of there, be somewhere else, pretend for a few days that my life hasn't fallen apart." Sarah's face softened with immediate understanding. "I'm so sorry," she said with genuine empathy. "Losing a parent is—" She stopped, searching for the right words. "It's like a part of you goes with him," Charles finished for her. "Even if our relationship wasn't perfect, even if there were unresolved issues, words left unsaid." Sarah nodded slowly. "I understand that more than you think. I may not have lost my father, but I lost something just as important. I lost the life I thought I would have." Charles looked at her with renewed interest. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked. She hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. Maybe talking to a stranger would be easier than talking to people who knew her and judged her. "I got divorced 8 months ago," Sarah began, her voice quiet but firm. 10 years of marriage went down the drain when I found out my husband was having an affair with his secretary. The oldest cliché in the book, right? She let out a bitter laugh. The worst part wasn't the betrayal, even though that hurt like hell. The worst part was realizing he'd probably been cheating on me for years, and I had been too stupid to notice. Charles frowned. "You weren't stupid," he said firmly. "You trusted him." "What are you supposed to do when you love someone?" Sarah felt tears stinging her eyes, but she held them back. "Thanks for saying that. Most people just look at me with pity. Or they tell me I should have seen it coming, like it was my fault for not being enough for him." Charles felt a wave of indignation rise inside him. "That guy is an idiot," he stated bluntly. Sarah couldn't help but smile at his frankness. "Yes, he is," she agreed. "But in a strange way, I'm grateful to him, because if this hadn't happened, I never would have found the courage to change my life." Charles tilted his head curiously. "What do you mean?" he asked. Sarah stroked Emma's hair tenderly before answering. "We lived in Chicago. I worked at an accounting firm, nothing exciting, but it paid the bills. After the divorce, I was left with very little. The house belonged to his family, the savings were split, and I ended up in a small apartment with Emma, trying to pretend everything was okay." She paused, taking a deep breath. "But it wasn't okay. Every corner of that city reminded me of what I'd lost. So, 2 months ago, I made the scariest decision of my life. I quit my job, sold the little I had, and decided to move to New York City." Charles looked at her with a mix of admiration and awe. "Do you have family there?" Sarah shook her head. "Just a distant cousin who offered to help while I get settled. I don't have a guaranteed job. I don't have a home of my own waiting for me. I have nothing, except this suitcase, my daughter, and the hope that we can start over." Her voice trembled slightly. "It's crazy, right?" Charles looked her straight in the eyes. "No," he said with total sincerity. "It's the bravest thing I've heard in a long time." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest at those words. Not many people saw her decision as bravery. Most thought she was being impulsive, irresponsible, that she was putting her daughter's well-being at risk. But this stranger, this man she had met less than an hour ago, understood. "Thank you," she whispered. "It means a lot to hear that." Charles nodded thoughtfully. "You know, I've spent my whole life calculating every move, planning every step with millimeter precision. I built a company from scratch. I accumulated more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. But I've never had the kind of courage you have. I've never taken a leap of faith without a safety net." Sarah looked at him curiously. "Why not?" He remained silent for a long moment before answering. "Because I'm afraid," he finally admitted. The confession slipped from his lips before he could stop it. "Afraid of what?" she asked softly. He lowered his gaze. "Of failing, of not being enough, of disappointing the people who depend on me." He let out a humorless laugh. "I'm especially afraid of being a father someday, of ruining a child the same way my father ruined me." And saying those words out loud for the first time in his life, he felt as if a huge weight was starting to lift from his shoulders. Sarah looked at him with an understanding that went beyond words. She could see the pain hidden behind those gray eyes, the wounded child that still lived inside the successful man. "Not everyone who is afraid admits it," she said softly. "That alone is an important step." Charles let out a long, deep sigh. "I don't know if it's a step or just a late confession. All my life, I've avoided serious relationships. That's exactly why I date women, yeah. But I never let them get too close. I never let things get serious, because deep down I'm terrified that if I ever start a family, if I ever have a child, I'm just going to repeat my father's same mistakes." He paused, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I don't want any kid growing up feeling as lonely as I did. I'd rather not have children at all than ruin their lives." Sarah felt her heart squeeze at such an honest, painful confession. She reached out and placed her hand over Charles's, the one Emma wasn't holding. The simple touch sent an unexpected warmth through her whole body. "But Charles," she murmured, "the fact that you have that fear means you're already different from your father." Charles looked up sharply, his eyes meeting hers. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice husky. Sarah held his gaze without letting go of his hand. Your father didn't worry about ruining you. He just did what he thought was right without questioning the emotional impact on you. But here you are, aware of that impact, worried about not repeating those patterns. That awareness alone makes you a completely different man. Charles felt something stir inside him, something that had been dormant for decades. He had never looked at it that way. He always thought his fear was a sign of weakness, just more proof that he wasn't cut out to be a father. But Sarah's words opened up a completely new perspective. Maybe his fear wasn't a life sentence, but an opportunity. Maybe acknowledging the wounds was the first step to not passing them on. He looked at Emma, sleeping, her face angelic in total rest, and for the first time in his life, he let himself imagine what it would be like to have a daughter. The image didn't terrify him as much as he expected. In fact, he felt something like hope. "How do you do it?" he asked suddenly. "How do I do what?" Sarah answered, confused. "Be a single mom," Charles clarified. "Face all those fears, alone. Moving to a new city without a safety net. Where do you get that strength?" Sarah smiled sadly. "I don't always feel strong," she admitted. "There are nights when Emma is asleep and I stay up wondering if I made the right decision. If I'm being selfish by dragging her into this uncertain adventure. If I shouldn't have just stayed in Chicago, in the familiar, even if it hurt. But then I see her smile, I hear her laugh, and I remind myself that kids are more resilient than we think." She paused, looking tenderly at her daughter. She needs to see her mom being brave. She needs to learn that it's okay to start over when something doesn't work out. She needs to know that self-love is more important than staying in a toxic situation just because you're scared of change. Charles nodded slowly, absorbing every word. "You're an incredible mother," he said with absolute sincerity. "Emma is very lucky to have you." Sarah felt tears threatening to spill over again. "Thank you," she whispered. "I needed to hear that." The plane began its slow descent toward New York City. The pilot announced that there were approximately 40 minutes left until landing. Some passengers started stretching, putting their things away, getting ready for arrival. But Charles and Sarah stayed in their little bubble of intimacy, oblivious to the bustle around them. "There's something I want you to know," Charles said suddenly, his voice thick with emotion. "In the last 40 minutes, I felt a more genuine connection with you than with anyone else in years. I don't know if it's the flight atmosphere or the vulnerable place we're both in, or just that you're an extraordinary person. But I want to thank you." Sarah looked at him, her eyes glistening. "Thank me for what?" "For reminding me that I'm still human," he replied. "For making me feel that maybe I'm not a lost cause. For listening to me without judgment." She shook her head gently. "I'm the one who should be thanking you, not just for helping Emma, but for making me feel seen. Since the divorce, I've carried this feeling of being invisible, of not mattering to anyone. And you really heard me." Charles squeezed her hand gently. The flight attendant passed by, offering water, and they both accepted, their throats dry after so much talking. Emma stirred slightly, a small sigh escaping her lips, but she didn't wake up. Her hand was still holding tight to Charles's finger, as if, even in her dreams, she knew she shouldn't let go. Charles smiled, watching her. "She's incredible," he murmured. "How can someone so small have such a big impact?" Sarah nodded. "Children have that ability to see past the masks we adults wear. Emma sensed your kindness, your authenticity. That's why she trusted you." Charles felt a lump in his throat. For years he had built walls so high around his heart that he had forgotten what it felt like to let them down. But on this flight, with this woman and her daughter, the walls had crumbled without him even noticing. And instead of feeling vulnerable or exposed, he felt liberated, like he could finally breathe after holding his breath for decades. "Sarah," he said softly. She looked at him expectantly. "When we land, when this is over, I'd like to see you again. You and Emma." "If you want to, of course." Sarah's heart skipped a beat at those words she hadn't expected to hear, but had secretly hoped for. Sarah didn't answer right away. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. One part of her was screaming yes, that this man seemed genuine and good, that the connection between them was undeniable. But another part, the part that had been betrayed and hurt, warned her to be cautious. They had only just met, barely 2 hours ago. She didn't know anything real, except what he had shared. What if it was too good to be true? What if she was romanticizing the moment because of the emotional intensity of the flight? Charles noticed her hesitation and quickly added, "I don't want to pressure you or make you feel uncomfortable. I totally understand if you prefer that this just stays a nice encounter on a plane and nothing more. I just wanted you to know that for me, it meant a lot." Sarah felt his sincerity in every word. She looked at her sleeping daughter, then at this man who had appeared in her life in the most unexpected way. "I'd like that," she finally said with a shy smile. "I'd like to see you again." Charles felt a joy burst in his chest, an emotion so pure and simple that it almost made him laugh. "Really?" he asked, unable to hide his surprise and happiness. "Really," she confirmed. "I don't know what's going to happen," Sarah continued honestly. "I don't know if this is just the excitement of the moment or something more, but I feel like it would be a mistake not to find out." Charles nodded eagerly. "Exactly. I'm not asking for promises or commitments, just the chance to get to know each other better without the pressure of a plane at 30,000 feet up." They both laughed softly at the comment. The tension that had momentarily appeared dissolved, replaced by a comfortable and hopeful warmth. Sarah looked out the window and could see the lights of New York City starting to appear in the distance. Her new life was waiting for her down there, full of uncertainties and possibilities. And now, completely unexpectedly, it included this mysterious man who had entered her life when she least expected it. "Where are you going to stay?" asked Charles. "With my cousin," replied Sarah. "She lives in Brooklyn. She's going to let me stay in her apartment until I get a place of my own." Charles nodded thoughtfully. "I have a hotel in Manhattan for the next 3 days. Then I go back to Chicago." A comfortable silence fell between them as they both processed what this meant. Sarah bit her lip, debating internally whether to ask the question that was on her mind. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said finally. Charles nodded. "Anything you want." "What do you do, exactly?" she asked. "You never mentioned it." Charles smiled slightly. "I own a tech company. We develop software for the financial sector. Nothing very exciting, honestly. Lots of meetings, lots of numbers, lots of stress." Sarah looked at him with renewed interest. "Sounds important." Charles shrugged. "It's lucrative, but it doesn't make me happy. I think I've been so busy building a business that I forgot to build a life." Sarah understood perfectly what he meant. She had spent years in a marriage that looked perfect from the outside, but was rotten on the inside. Both of them had been living lives that didn't really fulfill them. Maybe, she thought, this meeting was the chance they both needed to change that. "You know," said Sarah thoughtfully, "I think fate has mysterious ways of putting us exactly where we need to be." Charles, who had never been particularly spiritual, found that he couldn't argue with that statement. Emma began to move more actively, a sign that she was waking up. Her little eyes opened slowly, blinking in confusion for a moment before remembering where she was. She saw her mom first, then looked down and noticed she was still holding Charles's finger. A sleepy smile appeared on her face. "Hi," she said with a sleepy voice. "Hi, little one," replied Charles tenderly. "Did you sleep well?" Emma nodded. "I'm not scared anymore," she announced with childish pride. "The plane isn't moving bad anymore." Sarah stroked her daughter's hair with love. "No, sweetheart, the turbulence is over. We're going to land soon." Emma looked at Charles with those big, innocent eyes that seemed to look straight into a person's soul. "Are you still my friend?" she asked. Charles felt his heart melt completely. "Always," he promised. Emma smiled widely and finally let go of his finger, stretching like a little kitten after a nap. "I'm thirsty," she declared. Sarah handed her the half-finished orange juice, and Emma drank it with gusto. Charles took the moment to finally stand up from the aisle, his legs protesting the awkward position he'd held for so long. He sat down in the empty aisle seat across from them, stretching out his numb limbs. Sarah watched him with a mix of admiration and tenderness. This man had stayed in such an uncomfortable position for nearly an hour, just so he wouldn't disturb a little girl he'd barely met. That level of thoughtfulness and patience was rare to find. Emma finished her juice and stared out the window with renewed fascination. "Look, Mom, the lights!" she exclaimed excitedly. "That's New York City, honey," Sarah explained. "Our new home." Emma processed that information with the seriousness only children can show. "Are we going to be happy here?" she asked suddenly. The question struck Sarah right in the heart. She knelt in front of her daughter, taking her small hands in hers. "We're going to do everything we can to be happy," she promised. "It's going to be an adventure, with good things and difficult things, but we'll face them together, always together." Emma nodded, satisfied with the answer. Then she looked at Charles. "Are you going to be in our adventure too?" she asked with absolute innocence. Charles looked at Sarah, seeking guidance on how to answer. She nodded almost imperceptibly, giving him permission. "I'd love to be in your adventure," Charles replied with total honesty. "If you two will let me be a part of it." If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like this video. Emma clapped enthusiastically at Charles's answer, like she'd just received the best birthday present ever. Sarah felt her eyes well up again, moved by the pure simplicity of that moment. The pilot announced they were beginning their final descent and asked everyone to fasten their seatbelts and put their seats in the upright position. Charles went back to his row while Sarah helped Emma tighten her seatbelt properly. The little girl showed no signs of fear anymore. In fact, she seemed excited about the landing. "Look how big the lights are getting, Mom," she pointed out the window with fascination. "They look like little stars on the ground." Sarah smiled at her daughter's poetic description. "That's right, my love. Those are the buildings and streets of the people who live here. Soon we'll be walking down those streets." The plane descended smoothly, the city lights getting closer and more defined. Charles watched from his seat, his heart beating with a mix of anticipation and something he could only describe as hope. He had boarded this flight as a broken man, running from his demons, and he was about to get off as someone completely different, someone who had remembered how to feel. The plane's wheels touched the runway with a soft thud, and the aircraft began to slow down. Several passengers applauded, as was the custom on many American flights. Emma enthusiastically joined the applause, laughing with pure joy. Sarah hugged her tight against her chest, kissing her forehead over and over. "We made it, sweetie," she whispered. "We're here. We're finally safe." The plane taxied down the runway until it reached the arrival gate. The pilot gave the final instructions, and the passengers started getting up, popping open the overhead bins and grabbing their bags. Charles grabbed his carry-on briefcase, his only luggage for a business trip that had taken on a completely different meaning. He walked over to Sarah and Emma, who were still in their seats, waiting for the aisle to clear out a bit. "Need a hand with anything?" he asked. Sarah nodded gratefully. "I've got a big suitcase up there that I can't quite reach." Charles reached up easily and pulled down the suitcase, carefully setting it down in the aisle. "It's a heavy one," he commented with a smile. "My whole life is in there," Sarah replied with a nervous laugh. They began their slow shuffle down the plane's aisle, along with the rest of the passengers. Emma walked between the two adults, holding tight to her mom's hand, but she kept looking back to make sure Charles was still there. He'd wink at her every time their eyes met, making her smile. They stepped off the plane onto the jet bridge and then walked down the long corridors of JFK Airport. The place was buzzing with activity, even at that time of night. Families reuniting, taxi drivers offering rides, the smell of coffee and pretzels from the shops filling the air. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to calm the nerves that were starting to take hold of her now that the reality of her decision was becoming real. This was it. She'd really left everything behind. She was truly starting from scratch. Charles noticed the tension in her shoulders and moved a little closer. "Hey," he murmured softly. "It's gonna be okay." She looked at him and found a certainty in his eyes that helped her breathe easier. "Thank you," she whispered back. "For everything." They reached the baggage claim area and waited by their carousel. Emma was fascinated, watching the suitcases go round and round. "Look, Mom, that one has stickers. That one's huge. And that one has colorful wheels." Her childlike joy was contagious and managed to lighten the mood. A few minutes later, Sarah's big suitcase appeared on the carousel. Charles grabbed it before she could even try, hoisting it onto the cart they'd grabbed, then added his own small suitcase that had just come out too. They walked together toward the exit, passing through the security checks, and finally walking through the doors leading to the arrivals hall. The hall was packed with people waiting for their loved ones. Signs with names, balloons, flowers, hugs and tears everywhere. Sarah scanned the crowd for her cousin Rachel, who'd promised to be there to pick them up. Charles felt a pang in his chest. The moment to say goodbye was coming, and suddenly he didn't feel ready for it. He'd spent the last few hours in a bubble with these two special people. The thought of going back to his solitary life, to his empty hotel, his meaningless meetings, it all just seemed unbearable. "There she is," Sarah exclaimed, pointing toward a curly-haired woman holding a makeshift sign with Emma's name on it, decorated with drawn hearts. Rachel saw them at the same time and started waving her arms excitedly. Sarah felt a huge wave of relief mixed with nostalgia. Her cousin. Even though she hadn't seen her in years, she was her only family connection in this massive city. They walked toward her, and Rachel welcomed them with big, warm hugs. "Oh, cousin, you made it safely, thank goodness," she said, kissing Sarah on both cheeks. "And this cutie must be Emma." The little girl hid shyly behind her mom, still processing all the emotions of the day. Rachel then noticed Charles, standing a little ways off, holding the luggage cart. "And who is he?" she asked with obvious curiosity. Sarah hesitated a second before answering. "It's Charles," she finally said. "We met on the flight. He really helped Emma when she got scared during the turbulence." Rachel extended her hand toward Charles with a kind smile. "Nice to meet you, Charles. Any friend of my cousin is welcome." Charles shook her hand politely. "The pleasure is mine," he replied. But inside, he felt that the words "met on the flight" didn't do justice to what had really happened between them. Rachel took the handle of the cart from Charles's hands. "My car is in the parking garage on level 2, she explained. "It's not far, but with these suitcases, it's better if I help you." She looked at Charles expectantly, waiting for him to say goodbye and go on his way. But he didn't move. Sarah caught the awkwardness of the moment and quickly intervened. "Charles, we're going in that direction too. Your hotel is toward Manhattan, right? Maybe we can walk to the parking lot together." He nodded, grateful for the excuse to prolong his time with them, even if it was just for a few minutes more. The four of them walked together toward the parking garage, Rachel asking Sarah about the flight, while Emma held her mom's hand, but kept turning back constantly to make sure Charles was still close. The parking garage smelled like exhaust and concrete. The sounds of engines and car doors slamming echoed in the enclosed space. They arrived at Rachel's car, a blue SUV that had seen better days. Rachel opened the trunk and started arranging the suitcases. Charles helped lift the heaviest one, making sure it was positioned securely. "Done," Rachel announced, slamming the trunk shut firmly. "All right then, let's go home." Sarah turned toward Charles, and for a moment, both of them simply looked at each other, aware that this was really the end of their magical encounter. They had shared something deep and meaningful in the last few hours, but now real life was calling them back. "Thank you for everything," said Sarah, her voice slightly cracking. "I really don't know how to thank you for what you did for us." Charles shook his head. "You don't have to thank me for anything. If anything, I'm the one who should be thanking you." You reminded me that I can still feel, that there's still hope. Emma let go of her mom's hand and ran straight to Charles, wrapping her arms tightly around his legs. Don't go, she begged in a tiny voice. I want you to come with us. Sarah felt her heart break at her daughter's plea. Charles knelt down to get on Emma's level, looking at her with infinite tenderness. I'm not leaving forever, little one, he told her softly. Your mommy has my phone number, and I have hers. We'll see each other very soon, I promise. Emma looked at him with those big eyes, welling up with held-back tears. I promise. For real, for real, for real, Charles assured her, holding up his pinky finger. Emma linked her pinky with his, sealing the promise in the most sacred way she knew. Rachel watched the scene with growing interest, her eyes darting between Charles and Sarah. She'd clearly picked up that there was something more between these two than just a casual meeting on a plane. Charles slowly stood up and held out his hand to Sarah, but she ignored it and hugged him instead. It was a brief but intense hug, filled with all the words left unsaid and emotions they were only just beginning to understand. Take good care of yourself, she whispered in his ear. You too, he replied, his voice husky. And take care of that amazing little girl. They pulled away, their eyes locking for a second longer than necessary. Charles pulled his phone out of his pocket. Give me your number, he asked. I need to make sure you get to your cousin's place safely. Sarah recited her number, and he saved it right away, sending her a text so she'd have his, too. Done, he said, showing her the screen. Now there's no excuse not to stay in touch. Sarah smiled through the tears threatening to fall. No, there isn't, she agreed. Charles looked at Emma one last time. Take care of your mommy, he told her with playful seriousness. She's brave, but she needs someone to look after her, too. Emma nodded solemnly, taking her new role very seriously. I'll take care of her, she promised. And you have to take care of yourself, too. Charles grinned. I will, little one. Rachel finally spoke up, knowing that if she didn't step in, this goodbye could drag on all night. All right, family, it's getting late, and these two need some rest. Charles nodded, taking the hint. You're right. I should get to my hotel, too. He took a step back, creating physical distance, even though his heart protested. Sleep well, he said to all three of them. Sarah, talk tomorrow? She nodded quickly. Tomorrow, she confirmed. Charles gave them one last smile before turning around and walking toward the taxi stand. Each step felt heavier than the last. Sarah watched him walk away, his figure getting smaller in the distance. A part of her wanted to run after him, but her feet stayed firmly planted on the ground. Emma watched him go too, squeezing her mom's hand. Rachel opened the back door of the car. Come on, hop in before you change your minds and run after him, she joked, though her tone held a hint of seriousness. Sarah helped Emma into the back seat, but not before stealing one last glance at where Charles had disappeared into the crowd of travelers. Rachel started the car and began driving toward the parking lot exit. The silence inside the car was heavy, filled with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Rachel couldn't contain her curiosity any longer. Okay, cousin, you have to tell me what happened on that plane, because clearly it was much more than just helping Emma with the turbulence. Sarah sighed, looking out the window at the city lights rushing by. I don't know exactly, she admitted honestly. It was like the universe conspired to bring us together at the exact moment we both needed it. Rachel whistled softly. Sounds intense? It was, Sarah confirmed. Emma, from the back seat, added with the simple wisdom of a child, Charles is good, Mommy. He has sad eyes, but he also has a big heart. I can feel it. Sarah turned to look at her daughter, surprised by the depth of her observation. You're right, my love, she said softly. He has a very big heart. Rachel was driving along the expressway, heading toward Brooklyn. At that time of night, the traffic was light. So, are you going to see him again? She asked. Sarah nodded slowly. Yes, she replied with a mix of nervousness and excitement. He said he'd like to see us again. and for the first time in 8 months since her world collapsed, Sarah felt butterflies in her stomach at the possibility of something new. Charles arrived at his hotel in Manhattan close to midnight. The room was elegant and spacious, with a stunning view of the illuminated skyline. But it felt incredibly empty. He left his suitcase on the floor without even unpacking and sat on the edge of the bed, his phone in his hand. He looked at the screen where he had saved Sarah's number. He wanted to text her immediately, but he didn't want to look desperate or anxious, even though the truth was, he did feel anxious. Anxious to know that they had arrived safely. Anxious to hear her voice again. Anxious not to lose this connection he had found. He stood up and walked to the window, watching the city lights stretching out to the horizon. He thought about his father, about how he would have reacted to all this. He probably would have told him he was being foolish, that you can't get to know someone on a 2-hour flight, that he was confusing gratitude with something deeper. But Charles knew that his father had been wrong about many things. And this wasn't gratitude. This was something real. Something that had awakened a part of him he thought was dead. His phone vibrated in his hand, making him jump. It was a message from Sarah. The message simply said, "We got home safe. Emma won't stop talking about you. Thank you for making this day so special for us." Charles felt a smile spread across his face as he read and reread the words. His fingers flew across the keyboard, typing a reply. "I'm glad to know you got home safe. I can't stop thinking about you two either. That flight changed something in me." He pressed send before he could regret being so honest. Sarah's response came almost immediately. "It's strange for me too, right? Feeling like you know someone when you've barely just met them." Charles sat on the bed again, his heart beating faster. "It's not strange," he wrote. "It's perfect. I can call you tomorrow. I'd really like to hear your voice without all that airplane noise in the background." There was a longer pause this time, and Charles held his breath, waiting. Finally, the message came through. "I'd love that. Call me in the morning. Good night, Charles." He replied with a simple, "Good night, Sarah," and stared at the screen, feeling a warm glow in his chest. For the first time in weeks, maybe even years, he went to sleep with a smile on his face and hope in his heart. The next morning, Charles woke up earlier than usual. He showered and put on some casual clothes and ordered room service for breakfast. But he couldn't eat much. His stomach was tied in knots from nerves. At 9 o'clock sharp, he grabbed his phone and dialed Sarah's number. She answered on the second ring. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft and still a little sleepy. "Good morning," Charles replied, feeling like he sounded ridiculously happy, even to his own ears. "How did you sleep?" "Surprisingly well," Sarah admitted, although Emma woke up twice asking when you were coming to visit us. Charles laughed. "Well, that's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. I know you just got here and probably have a million things to do, but I was wondering if you two would like to grab breakfast, or lunch, or whatever." Sarah went quiet for a moment, and Charles worried he'd been too direct. But then she spoke with a soft laugh. "I'd love that, Charles. But I have to warn you, Emma probably won't leave you alone. She's already adopted you as her favorite person." "That sounds perfect to me," he replied with total sincerity. They agreed to meet at noon at a cafe in Brooklyn, near Rachel's apartment. Charles spent the next few hours trying to get some work done on his laptop, checking emails and getting ready for his business meeting the next day. But he just couldn't concentrate. His mind kept drifting back to Sarah, to Emma, and to that sense of purpose he'd found on the plane. At 11:30, he got ready with more care than he had in months. He looked in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back at him. His eyes didn't look so dull anymore. There was actually some life in them. He took another taxi over to Brooklyn, his heart pounding with anticipation. The cafe was a cozy spot, with exposed brick walls and plants hanging from the ceiling, serving classic American brunch like avocado toast and fresh bagels. He got there 10 minutes early and picked a table near the window. He ordered an Americano and waited, keeping his eyes glued to the door. At exactly 12 o'clock, he saw Sarah walk in,
holding Emma's hand. The little girl was wearing a sundress, and her eyes scanned the room until she found him. Her face lit up with a huge smile. "Charles!" she shouted, letting go of her mom's hand and running straight toward him. Charles stood up just in time to catch her, lifting her up in a hug that felt like coming home.
Sarah walked over to them, a smile making her eyes sparkle. Charles noticed she'd done her hair, that she was wearing a little bit of makeup, and that she looked beautiful in the natural midday light. "Hi," she said softly as she reached the table. "Hi," he replied, still holding Emma, who had wrapped her little arms around his neck. They sat down and ordered. Emma asked for pancakes with lots of maple syrup, Sarah a veggie omelet, and Charles some eggs Benedict. The conversation flowed just as naturally as the night before on the plane. They talked about everything and nothing. Sarah told him about Rachel's apartment, small but cozy, and about her plans to start job hunting next week. Maybe in marketing, since she'd always wanted to try something creative. Charles spoke about his meeting the next day, admitting that for the first time in his life, he was considering turning down a $1 million contract simply because it didn't excite him. Emma ate her pancakes, but kept constantly interrupting with questions for Charles, asking if he had a dog, if he liked superheroes, if he knew how to play tag. He answered every question with patience and genuine humor. Sarah watched them interact and felt her heart swell with an emotion she hadn't felt in years. This felt right. This felt like family. And that terrified and thrilled her at the same time. After breakfast, Charles suggested taking a walk through Prospect Park, which was nearby. Emma skipped ahead of them, stopping every few feet to look at the squirrels scampering by or the ducks in the pond. Charles and Sarah walked side by side, their hands brushing occasionally, but without actually holding hands. The silence between them was comfortable, full of unspoken possibilities. Finally, Charles broke the silence. "Sarah, I have to confess something." She looked at him with curiosity, mixed with a touch of worry. "What is it?" He took a deep breath before continuing. "When I got on that plane last night, I was at the lowest point of my life. I had buried my father without being able to mourn his death. I was running away from everything that hurt, and honestly, I didn't see much point in going on." Sarah stopped dead in her tracks, turning completely toward him. "Charles," she murmured with concern. He raised a hand to stop her. "Let me finish. Then I met a scared little girl and her brave mother, and in a matter of hours, they reminded me what it means to be alive. They reminded me that I can still feel, I can still connect, I can still matter to someone. And I want you to know that I'm not here out of gratitude or pity or because I'm confused. I'm here because in 2 hours I felt more for you and Emma than I've felt for anyone in years." Sarah felt tears start rolling down her cheeks. "Charles, I feel something too," she admitted with a trembling voice. "But I'm so afraid. Afraid that I'm making a mistake again. Afraid of hurting Emma if this doesn't work out. Afraid to trust someone after what happened." Charles took her hands in his, looking her straight in the eyes. "I'm afraid too," he said with total honesty. "I'm afraid of not being enough, of failing, of ruining this thing that is so special. But something I learned last night is that fear can't be the only reason not to try. If we let fear decide for us, we'll never really live." Sarah nodded slowly, tears still falling, but now with a smile on her lips. "You're right. I've spent so much time protecting myself that I forgot how to open up. But you're different, Charles. I don't know how to explain it, but I can see it in the way you were with Emma. Like when you added that extra story about your own childhood fear to make her feel less alone." Emma ran back toward them right then. "Why is Mommy crying?" she asked worriedly. Sarah knelt down to get on her daughter's level, wiping away her tears. "They're happy tears, my love. Sometimes we cry when we're really happy." Emma looked at Charles as if asking for confirmation. Charles knelt down too, leaving the three of them at eye level in the middle of the park. "Emma," he said softly, "can I ask you something important?" The little girl nodded seriously. "How would you feel if I spent more time with you guys?
If I visited you too often, took you to pretty places, and tried to be part of your life? Emma thought about it for a moment with the seriousness of a judge. Would you be like my dad? She asked, point blank. The question landed like a bomb between the three of them. Sarah held her breath.
Charles felt his throat tighten with emotion. I wouldn't be your dad right away, he answered honestly, because that's something very special that takes time. But I'd love to try and be that someday, if you let me, if your mommy lets me. Emma thought about it for a moment with the seriousness of a judge. So, are you going to take care of my mommy? She asked. Because she's sad sometimes, even if she pretends she isn't. And are you going to take care of me too, even if I misbehave sometimes? Charles felt tears stinging his own eyes. I promise to take care of your mommy with all my heart, he said with a voice cracking with emotion. And you too, always. Even when you misbehave, which I bet almost never happens. Emma grinned widely. Okay, she declared. Then that sounds good to me. You can be our special friend. And with the innocent approval of a 7-year-old, something that had been broken inside Charles finally began to heal. The three of them stayed there kneeling a moment longer before getting up. Emma took Charles's hand with one of hers and her mom's with the other, walking between them with a smile from ear to ear. They spent the rest of the afternoon together. They visited an ice cream shop where Emma tried 3 different flavors before deciding on vanilla with sprinkles. They went to a bookstore where Charles bought Emma an illustrated book about airplanes, winking at Sarah while he did it, and added a coffee table book on New York landmarks for Sarah to dream about their future explorations. They walked through the streets of Brooklyn, discovering street art and little hidden bakeries. And at some point, while Emma got distracted watching a street musician playing jazz, Charles took Sarah's hand, and she didn't let go. When the sun started to set, Charles walked them back to Rachel's apartment. Standing in front of the building, neither of them wanted the day to end. When do you go back to Chicago? Sarah asked. Tomorrow night after my meeting, Charles replied. But I'm already thinking about canceling some commitments so I can come back next weekend. If you want me to come back, that is. Sarah squeezed his hand. I want you to come back. Emma and I want you to come back. Charles said goodbye to Emma with another long hug, promising her he'd return soon. Then he looked at Sarah, hesitating a moment before leaning in and kissing her softly on the cheek. See you soon, he whispered. She nodded, her eyes shining with happy tears. See you soon. 2 days later, on a Saturday afternoon, the doorbell rang at Rachel's apartment. Sarah opened the door, and there stood Charles with a bouquet of flowers in one hand and a blue stuffed airplane in the other. I couldn't wait until the weekend, he admitted with a shy smile. Emma came running out from behind her mom and squealed with joy when she saw him. Charles, you came back! She threw herself into his arms, and he lifted her up laughing while she planted a kiss on his cheek. I told you I'd come back, little one. I always keep my promises. Sarah took the flowers with trembling hands, her heart so full she felt like it was about to burst. Charles looked at her over the top of Emma's head, and in his eyes she saw a future. She saw hope. She saw love. She saw a family. And for the first time since her world had crumbled 8 months ago, Sarah felt that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. Better than okay. It was going to be beautiful. This story reminds us that the most important encounters of our lives often arrive when we least expect them. Charles got on that plane running away from his pain, Sarah looking for a fresh start, and Emma simply needing to feel safe. What they found was so much more than that. They found hope, healing, and the possibility of a family, built not by blood, but by choice and genuine love. Sometimes fate puts us exactly where we need to be, with the people we need to meet at the perfect moment. They could be on a plane, in a coffee shop, anywhere. What matters is being open to those connections, having the courage to be vulnerable and allowing ourselves to trust again, even when we've been hurt. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit like on this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Every story we share here is a reminder that love, kindness, and new beginnings are always possible. May you find the courage to trust again and the wisdom to recognize blessings when they arrive, disguised as strangers on a red-eye flight.